Lieutenant Robert Best of Bombing Squadron 6 aboard the USS Enterprise first spotted the Japanese mobile force through his telescope sight at 1005 hours on June 4, 1942, as 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers began their attack on the 4 aircraft carriers of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's First Air Fleet. The sight of the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu spread across 15 miles of Pacific Ocean, their flight decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, would mark the decisive moment when American naval aviation destroyed the heart of Japanese carrier striking power and transformed the Pacific War from a defensive struggle into an offensive campaign that would end at Tokyo Bay. Best's position as flight leader of Bombing Squadron 6 placed him at the apex of the most critical dive bombing attack in naval history, as intelligence derived from Japanese naval code intercepts had provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with precise knowledge of enemy intentions and dispositions. The Japanese plan, designated Operation MI by the Imperial Japanese Navy, called for Admiral Nagumo's mobile force to approach Midway Atoll from the northwest while a separate invasion force landed ground troops to capture the island that served as the westernmost American outpost in the Central Pacific. The Japanese mobile force that Best observed through his bombsight consisted of the most powerful concentration of aircraft carriers ever assembled by any navy in 1942. The flagship Akagi, a 42,000-ton converted battlecruiser, carried 66 aircraft including 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, 18 Aichi D3A Val dive bombers, and 27 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. The carrier Kaga, originally laid down as a battleship before conversion under the Washington Naval Treaty, displaced 43,650 tons and embarked 72 aircraft in similar proportions. The newer carriers Soryu and Hiryu, purpose-built for aircraft operations rather than converted from capital ship hulls, represented the most advanced carrier design in the Japanese fleet. The Soryu carried 57 aircraft while the Hiryu embarked 64, both ships optimized for speed and aircraft handling rather than armor protection. Together, the 4 carriers of the mobile force could launch 259 aircraft, more than double the combined air strength available to the Americans at Midway Atoll and the 3 carriers of Task Force 16 and Task Force 17. But the strategic advantage that enabled Best's attack on the Japanese carriers was intelligence rather than numerical superiority. The cryptanalysts of Station HYPO at Pearl Harbor, led by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rockefort, had broken the Japanese Naval Code JN-25 and provided Admiral Nimitz with complete details of Operation MI, including the timing, approach routes, and objectives of every element of the Japanese plan. The Americans knew that Admiral Nagumo would strike Midway at dawn on June 4th before turning northeast to engage the American fleet that the Japanese assumed would sortie from Pearl Harbor after the attack began. The tactical deployment that Admiral Raymond Spruance had chosen for Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, reflected the intelligence advantage that American codebreakers had provided. Instead of remaining at Pearl Harbor until after the Midway attack began, Spruance positioned his force 200 miles northeast of Midway, where it could launch a surprise attack on the Japanese carriers while they were engaged in striking the island. The element of surprise that had enabled Japanese success at Pearl Harbor would now work in favor of the Americans. Best's observation of the Japanese formation revealed both the strength and the critical vulnerability that would determine the outcome of the Battle of Midway. The 4 carriers of the mobile force were operating in a diamond formation with the Akagi and Kaga to port and the Soryu and Hiryu to starboard, surrounded by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that provided anti-aircraft protection and surface combat capability. But the concentration of all 4 carriers within 15 miles of each other meant that a successful attack on the formation could potentially damage or sink multiple carriers simultaneously. The Japanese tactical doctrine that Admiral Nagumo was following required him to maintain his 4 carriers in close formation to concentrate their defensive firepower and coordinate their air operations. The mobile force had been designed to operate as a unified striking unit that could overwhelm any enemy force through the coordinated efforts of nearly 260 aircraft launched simultaneously from 4 flight decks. But this concentration also created a target that American dive bombers could attack with devastating effect if they could penetrate the Japanese fighter cover and anti-aircraft defenses. Best's Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber was armed with a single 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb capable of penetrating the flight deck of any aircraft carrier and detonating in the hangar deck where fueled and armed aircraft would create secondary explosions and fires. The SBD Dauntless had been designed specifically for precision attacks against heavily defended targets, with dive brakes that allowed controlled dives at near-vertical angles and a telescopic bomb sight that enabled accurate delivery even under combat conditions. The approach that Best's formation took to the Japanese mobile force demonstrated the tactical coordination that American naval aviation had developed through intensive training and combat experience in the 6 months since Pearl Harbor. Bombing Squadron 6 from the Enterprise attacked simultaneously with Bombing Squadron 3 from the Yorktown and elements of Bombing Squadron 8 from the Hornet, creating a coordinated assault from multiple directions that divided Japanese defensive attention and prevented concentrated anti-aircraft fire against any single attack group. But the success of the American dive bomber attack was enabled by the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, which had attacked the Japanese carriers 30 minutes earlier and been completely destroyed by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. All 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadron 8 were shot down, with only one survivor, Ensign George Gay, who spent hours floating in the Pacific while the battle raged around him. The torpedo attack had failed to score a single hit on the Japanese carriers, but it had drawn the Zero fighters down to sea level, where they could not intercept the dive bombers approaching from 19,000 feet. Best's view of the Japanese carrier Akagi through his bomb sight at 1,022 hours on June 4 showed a flight deck crowded with aircraft being prepared for a second strike against Midway Atoll. The Japanese had launched their first attack at 0430 hours with 108 aircraft. But the strike leader had radioed that a second attack would be necessary to neutralize the American base completely. Admiral Nagumo had ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with bombs for land attack rather than torpedoes for anti-ship operations, a decision that left the Japanese carriers vulnerable during the critical moment when American dive bombers began their attack. The Japanese aircraft that Best observed on the Akagi's flight deck represented the finest naval aviation equipment in the world in June 1942. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters possessed superior speed, range, and maneuverability compared to any American fighter aircraft, while the Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers had demonstrated devastating effectiveness against Allied naval forces throughout the Pacific. But the concentration of fueled and armed aircraft on the carrier's flight deck and in the hangar deck below created the conditions for catastrophic destruction if American bombs could penetrate the ship's defenses. The dive bombing attack that Best led against the Akagi began at 1,022 hours as the SBD Dauntless pushed over into its attack dive from 19,000 feet, accelerating to over 240 miles per hour while Best centered the Japanese flagship in his telescopic bomb sight. The anti-aircraft fire from the Akagi and her escorts filled the sky with black puffs of smoke and streams of tracer ammunition, but the steep angle and high speed of the dive bomber's approach made accurate defensive fire almost impossible. Best's 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb struck the Akagi just aft of the midships elevator at 1,026 hours, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the upper hangar deck where 18K torpedo bombers were being rearmed with 1,760-pound armor-piercing bombs intended for use against American carriers. The explosion of Best's bomb triggered secondary explosions among the armed aircraft and aviation gasoline that created an inferno throughout the ship's interior. Within minutes, the Akagi was burning out of control with fires spreading to her engine rooms and magazines. The simultaneous attack by other elements of the American dive bomber force achieved similar devastating results against the remaining Japanese carriers. The carrier Kaga took 4 direct hits from SBD Dauntless bombers of Bombing Squadron 6, with bombs penetrating her flight deck and detonating among fueled aircraft in the hangar deck. The resulting fires and explosions gutted the ship's interior and made damage control impossible. The Kaga would burn for hours before sinking that evening with the loss of over 800 officers and men. The carrier Soryu was attacked by Bombing Squadron 3 from the Yorktown and took 3 direct hits that penetrated her flight deck and started uncontrollable fires among the aircraft and aviation fuel stored in her hangar deck. The Soryu's smaller size compared to the Akagi and Kaga made her more vulnerable to bomb damage, and the carrier was abandoned within 20 minutes of the attack. She would sink at 1913 hours with the loss of 718 officers and men, including her captain who chose to go down with his ship. Best's observation of the Japanese formation after the dive bomber attacks revealed the complete transformation of the tactical situation within the space of 6 minutes. At 1,020 hours, Admiral Nagumo commanded the most powerful carrier striking force in the Pacific, with 4 fleet carriers capable of launching coordinated attacks against any American naval force. By 10:26 hours, 3 of his 4 carriers were burning wrecks that would sink before the day ended, and Japanese naval aviation had suffered losses that would require years to replace. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, had been operating separated from the main formation and escaped the initial American attack. But Best's continuing observation of the battle revealed that the Hiryu's survival would be temporary. The remaining Japanese carrier launched 2 desperate counterattacks against the American task force, severely damaging the USS Yorktown with dive bombers and torpedo planes. But American search aircraft located the Hiryu at 1,445 hours, and a strike force of 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise attacked the last Japanese carrier at 1,700 hours. The destruction of the Hiryu by Enterprise dive bombers completed the annihilation of Admiral Nagumo's mobile force and eliminated Japanese carrier striking power in the Pacific for the remainder of 1942. The 4 fleet carriers lost at Midway had constituted the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, with trained aircrews and experienced maintenance personnel that could not be quickly replaced. More critically, the loss of the carriers ended Japanese offensive capability in the Central Pacific and forced a shift to defensive operations that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. Best's analysis of the Japanese tactical failures that enabled the American victory revealed fundamental weaknesses in Imperial Japanese Navy doctrine that would plague Japanese operations throughout the remainder of the war. The decision to concentrate all 4 carriers in a single formation had maximized their striking power but also created a single target that could be attacked simultaneously. The Japanese failure to maintain adequate fighter cover at high altitude had allowed American dive bombers to penetrate their defenses without interference. But the most critical Japanese failure was the decision to change the armament of reserve aircraft from anti-ship weapons to land attack weapons during the battle. Admiral Nagumo's order to rearm his aircraft for a second strike against Midway left the Japanese carriers vulnerable during the precise moment when American dive bombers arrived overhead. Had the Japanese maintained their aircraft in anti-ship configuration, they might have been able to launch a coordinated strike against the American carriers before the dive bomber attack began. The strategic consequences of the Midway victory were immediately apparent to Best and the other American participants as they realized that the Japanese advance across the Pacific had been permanently halted. The mobile force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months had been destroyed in a single day. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed irreversibly to the United States, and the long road to Tokyo could now begin. The intelligence advantage that had enabled the American victory at Midway demonstrated the decisive importance of communications intelligence in modern naval warfare. The ability of American cryptanalysts to break Japanese naval codes and provide precise information about enemy intentions had overcome the numerical superiority that the Japanese possessed in carriers and aircraft. The Battle of Midway proved that superior intelligence could be more valuable than superior firepower when properly exploited by skilled commanders and courageous aircrews. Best's detailed observation of Japanese carrier operations during the battle provided valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and limitations that would influence American tactical development throughout the Pacific War. The effectiveness of concentrated dive bomber attacks against mass carrier formations led to adoption of similar tactics by American task forces, while the vulnerability of carriers with aircraft spotted on deck convinced American commanders of the importance of maintaining fighter cover and dispersed formations. The technological lessons learned from the Midway battle accelerated American development of improved aircraft and weapons systems that would provide decisive advantages in subsequent engagements. The superior performance of the SBD Dauntless dive bomber in attacking heavily defended targets led to continued production and deployment of the aircraft throughout 1942 and 1943. The failure of the TBD Devastator torpedo bomber to penetrate Japanese defenses convinced the Navy to accelerate development of the TBF Avenger, which would prove much more effective in later battles. The tactical innovations that emerged from the Midway experience included improved coordination between dive bombers and torpedo planes, better fighter escort procedures, and enhanced anti-aircraft defense techniques. The American success in achieving surprise despite Japanese numerical superiority demonstrated the importance of operational security and deception in carrier operations. The lessons learned at Midway would be applied throughout the Solomon Islands campaign and subsequent Central Pacific operations. Best's survival of the Midway battle and his detailed recollection of the Japanese formation and tactics contributed to American understanding of enemy capabilities and the development of countermeasures that would prove effective throughout the Pacific War. His observation that Japanese pilots displayed exceptional skill and courage while operating under tactical doctrine that created vulnerabilities influenced American training programs and operational planning for subsequent engagements. The human dimension of the Midway victory was as significant as its strategic consequences, as the courage and skill displayed by American aircrews demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation was not invincible despite its early victories. The willingness of Torpedo Squadron 8 to press home their attack despite overwhelming odds, and the precision of the dive bomber pilots who placed their bombs with devastating accuracy, proved that American naval aviation could match Japanese performance when provided with proper equipment and training. The industrial implications of the Midway victory became apparent in the months following the battle as American shipyards began producing aircraft carriers at a rate that Japanese industry could not match. The 4 fleet carriers lost by Japan at Midway represented irreplaceable assets that had taken years to build and could not be quickly replaced. In contrast, American carrier construction accelerated throughout 1942 and 1943, providing the naval aviation strength necessary for offensive operations across the Pacific. Best's analysis of the battle damage sustained by the Japanese carriers revealed the effectiveness of American ordnance and the vulnerability of carrier flight decks to precision bombing attacks. The 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs carried by the SBD Dauntless proved capable of penetrating carrier flight decks and causing catastrophic damage when they detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The fires and secondary explosions that resulted from successful bomb hits made damage control impossible and led to the total loss of 3 carriers within hours of the attack. The medical innovations that emerged from treating casualties during the Midway battle included improved techniques for treating burns and shock, enhanced procedures for battlefield surgery aboard ships, and better methods for evacuating wounded personnel from damaged vessels. The experience gained in treating combat casualties at Midway influenced American naval medical practices throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The logistics lessons learned from the Midway operation demonstrated the importance of advanced base facilities and mobile supply capabilities in supporting carrier operations far from established bases. The ability of American forces to operate from Midway Atoll, while the Japanese were forced to rely on distant bases in the Marshall Islands, provided a significant tactical advantage that influenced the outcome of the battle. Best's documentation of Japanese aircraft performance during the battle provided valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities that influenced American fighter development throughout the war. The superior maneuverability and range of the Mitsubishi A6M0 convinced American designers that new fighters would require improved performance rather than simply heavier armament. The development of the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair was directly influenced by analysis of Japanese aircraft observed during the Midway battle. The strategic deception that preceded the Midway battle demonstrated the potential for communications intelligence to provide decisive advantages in modern warfare. The ability of American cryptanalysts to break Japanese naval codes and provide accurate intelligence about enemy intentions enabled Admiral Nimitz to position his forces for maximum tactical advantage. The success of American deception operations convinced Japanese commanders that their codes remained secure, allowing continued exploitation of communications intelligence throughout the Pacific War. The tactical coordination that enabled the American victory at Midway became the foundation for carrier task force operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The integration of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters in coordinated strikes against heavily defended targets provided the template for subsequent operations from Guadalcanal through the final attacks on Japan. The precision timing and mutual support demonstrated by American aircrews at Midway set the standard for naval aviation performance throughout the war. Best's observation of the psychological impact of the battle on both American and Japanese personnel revealed the importance of morale and confidence in determining the outcome of naval engagements. The shock of losing 4 fleet carriers in a single day shattered Japanese confidence in their naval aviation superiority and forced a fundamental reassessment of their strategic position in the Pacific. Conversely, the American victory at Midway demonstrated that the United States Navy could defeat the Japanese fleet in a direct confrontation, providing the confidence necessary for subsequent offensive operations. The intelligence analysis that followed the Midway battle revealed the sophistication of Japanese operational planning and the risks inherent in complex multi-phase operations. The Japanese plan to capture Midway while simultaneously engaging the American fleet required precise timing and coordination that proved vulnerable to American interference. The failure of the Japanese to achieve surprise, combined with their inability to adapt to changing tactical conditions, demonstrated the limitations of rigid operational planning in modern warfare. The technological assessment of weapons performance during the Midway battle influenced American ordnance development throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The effectiveness of the 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb against carrier targets led to continued production and improvement of similar weapons. The failure of American torpedo bombers to achieve hits against maneuvering targets convinced naval planners of the need for improved torpedo design and delivery techniques. Best's detailed observation of Japanese damage control procedures provided valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and limitations that influenced American tactical planning for subsequent engagements. The inability of Japanese carriers to control fires and explosions caused by bomb hits revealed vulnerabilities in their design and construction that could be exploited in future attacks. The contrast between Japanese and American damage control capabilities became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. The cultural impact of the Midway victory extended throughout American society as news of the Japanese defeat demonstrated that the Empire of Japan was not invincible despite its early victories in the Pacific. The destruction of the mobile force that had attacked Pearl Harbor provided a sense of retribution that sustained American morale throughout the long Pacific campaign. The heroism displayed by American aircrews at Midway became a symbol of American determination and sacrifice in the struggle against fascism. Best's survival of the Midway battle and his subsequent service throughout the Pacific War demonstrated the evolution of American naval aviation from the desperate improvisation of early 1942 to the overwhelming superiority achieved by 1945. The lessons learned during the crucial hours over the Japanese mobile force influenced every aspect of American carrier operations, from aircraft design and pilot training to tactical doctrine and operational planning. The strategic momentum generated by the Midway victory enabled American forces to begin offensive operations in the Solomon Islands just 2 months after the battle. The confidence gained from defeating the Japanese fleet in a direct confrontation provided the foundation for the Guadalcanal campaign and subsequent advances across the Central Pacific. The initiative seized at Midway would never be relinquished, leading ultimately to the surrender of Japan in Tokyo Bay. The logistics revolution that supported American operations after Midway demonstrated the industrial capacity and organizational skill that would prove decisive in the Pacific War. The ability to maintain and supply carrier task forces operating thousands of miles from established bases required innovations in mobile logistics that transformed naval warfare. The techniques developed to support operations after Midway influenced American military logistics throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Best's analysis of the factors that contributed to the American victory at Midway emphasized the importance of intelligence, training, and courage in overcoming numerical disadvantage. The combination of superior intelligence from code-breaking, intensive training that prepared American aircrews for precision attacks under combat conditions, and the willingness of individual pilots to press home their attacks despite overwhelming odds created the conditions for one of the most decisive naval victories in history. The technological legacy of the Midway battle included advances in carrier design, aircraft performance, and weapon systems that would influence naval warfare for decades after the war ended. The lessons learned about carrier vulnerability and the effectiveness of dive bombing attacks influenced the design of post-war aircraft carriers and the development of guided missiles that would eventually replace manned aircraft in anti-ship operations. The intelligence revolution that began with the code-breaking success at Midway transformed American military capabilities throughout the remainder of the war and established the foundation for modern signals intelligence operations. The ability to intercept and decode enemy communications provided decisive advantages in subsequent battles and demonstrated the crucial importance of information superiority in modern warfare. Best's final assessment of the Midway battle emphasized the transformation of the Pacific War from a desperate defensive struggle to a confident offensive campaign that would end with complete victory over Japan. The destruction of the Japanese mobile force eliminated the primary threat to American naval operations in the Pacific and created the conditions for sustained offensive operations that would continue until the Japanese surrender. The human cost of the Midway victory was measured not only in the casualties suffered by both sides, but in the courage and sacrifice of the aircrews who pressed home their attacks despite overwhelming odds. The pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8 who were shot down before reaching their targets, and the dive bomber pilots who achieved precision hits despite intense anti-aircraft fire, demonstrated the highest traditions of naval aviation and established the standard for performance throughout the Pacific War. The strategic consequences of the Midway victory extended far beyond the immediate destruction of Japanese carrier forces to encompass the entire course of World War II in the Pacific. The elimination of Japanese offensive capability forced a shift to defensive operations that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. The initiative gained at Midway enabled American forces to begin the long advance across the Pacific that would end with the occupation of Japan. Best's observation of the Japanese fleet during its final moments of supremacy provided a unique perspective on one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The sight of 4 aircraft carriers burning simultaneously marked the end of Japanese naval aviation dominance and the beginning of American supremacy in the Pacific. The transformation that occurred during 6 minutes of dive bombing attacks changed the course of the Pacific War and influenced the outcome of World War II. The tactical lessons learned from the Midway battle influenced naval aviation doctrine throughout the Cold War and beyond, as the principles of concentration, surprise, and precision attack demonstrated during the destruction of the Japanese mobile force remained relevant in the age of nuclear weapons and guided missiles. The courage and skill displayed by American aircrews at Midway set the standard for naval aviation performance that continues to inspire military aviators today. When I saw American dive bombers destroy the Japanese fleet at Midway, I witnessed the moment when the course of the Pacific War was determined and the ultimate outcome of World War II was decided. The sight of the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu burning simultaneously marked the end of one era in naval warfare and the beginning of another, as American industrial capacity and technological innovation combined with superior intelligence and extraordinary courage to achieve one of the most decisive victories in naval history. The destruction of Admiral Nagumo's mobile force in 6 minutes of precision dive bombing demonstrated that in modern warfare, superior intelligence and tactical skill could overcome numerical advantage and early success. The Japanese fleet that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was eliminated in a single engagement, proving that the Empire of Japan was not invincible and that American determination and capability could achieve victory against any enemy. The strategic transformation that began at Midway would continue throughout the Pacific War as American forces advanced from island to island, destroying Japanese bases and eliminating enemy forces in a methodical campaign that demonstrated the effectiveness of American military doctrine and industrial capacity. The initiative seized during those crucial hours over the Japanese mobile force would never be relinquished, leading ultimately to the complete defeat of Japan and the establishment of American hegemony in the Pacific. When I saw American dive bombers destroy the Japanese fleet at Midway, I knew that the United States had turned the corner in the Pacific War and that ultimate victory was now inevitable. The courage of the aircrews who pressed home their attacks against overwhelming odds, combined with the intelligence that enabled surprise and the training that ensured precision, had achieved a victory that would be remembered as long as naval aviation existed. The sight of those Japanese carriers burning on June 4, 1942, marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire and the start of America's rise to global supremacy.